they were all trying to solve this thing, and of course it wasn't a contentious paper because it was just saying, okay, here's 5 different ways to try and address this issue of Harry and Meghan wanting a different way of working.
Hello, welcome. My name is Kate Mansey. I'm assistant editor at The Times, and today I'm joined for Royal Confidential by Valentine Low, to give you your full name, formerly of The Times as well. So it's really nice to have you back, Val.
Nice to be on the show. Thank you.
We wanted to just have a quick chat about your brilliant book, Courtiers, which is now the kind of go-to Bible to look up anything about the people who work in the palace, the people that we might know about, the names that have been out in public, but also those people that work behind the scenes and really get involved with the nitty-gritty of how the palace works, how the royal family work. And if you could explain, first of all, what a courtier is and what they do, why are they so important?
Well, they're the people who run the show. In Buckingham Palace, there are an awful lot of courtiers doing an awful lot of jobs. Everything from advising the monarch to running the money, running the ceremonial, running the sort of hotel bits of the palace, the catering and all that sort of stuff, the banquets. But the important people are really the private secretaries, who are very, very close to the members of the royal family. And they advise them on all sorts of things, on policy. They help them write their speeches. They act as gatekeepers. They control who gets to see the members of the royal family, and they're with them all the time. So if you imagine, say, the king going to some engagement by car, the private secretary will be in the back of the car with them. So they get a lot of contact. They're very, very close to them. When George V had this private secretary called Lord Stamfordham, who had been around for ages, he goes back to the Victorian era, and he died in, I think, about 1931 or so, aged 81, still in service. And when he died, the king was absolutely bereft, and Queen Mary wrote that he was left in a state of loneliness such as comes from losing a dear departed nanny. I mean, that's the kind of nature of the relationship.
So very close. It reminds me of that kind of the Game of Thrones, the hand of the king. That's that person who's always by their side and does their bidding and advises them, and without whom they'd be completely sort of hopeless, I guess.
Yeah, and always by their side. So occasionally you see these documentaries on television, and these kind of slightly fly on the wall documentaries, and the person who's hovering next to the king, handing him a pen at the crucial moment, it's the private secretary. They're always there saying, "Yes, sir," and "Would you mind doing this, sir?"
And hopefully that pen isn't a leaky one, because who knows how long they'd keep their job otherwise, I guess.
Hopefully not. The pens are carefully vetted now.
Yes. So what about the current reign? I mean, from what you've looked at for your book, Courtiers, what's the difference, do you think, in between the way the courtiers were around the late Queen and the way that the king has his courtiers around him? Is there much of a difference in between? Obviously, the difference in the names of the people involved, but in terms of the kind of the institution and how it's managed.
I think the one difference I sense is that there's been an slight expansion in the numbers, because when Charles was Prince of Wales, was over at Clarence House, he had far more private secretaries than the Queen had. He had loads of them because he was so busy, interested in so many areas, whereas the Queen just very regimentedly had 3. She had the principal private secretary, the deputy, and the assistant, and that was it. I mean, obviously a lot of staff all around there, but in terms of those key advisors, there were just 3 of them. And I feel there's been a little bit of advisor inflation under Charles.
Advisor inflation. I suppose like you say, he's doing quite a lot that perhaps the late Queen didn't when he had all sorts of charities that he had to manage, yes, and that sort of thing.
Exactly.
And now they haven't always come in for such an easy ride from everybody within the royal family, because we've had Princess Diana, Fergie, the Duchess of York call them the men in grey suits rather disparagingly. And why are they so divisive for some members of the firm, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, when Fergie was around, you've got to remember the Queen's private fellows, the Queen's private secretary, Sir Robert Fellows, was her father's first cousin. And in her memoir, she couldn't, much as Harry in his memoir referred to the bee, the fly, and the wasp, the sort of hated triumvirate of private secretaries who he just simply couldn't stand. Fergie couldn't bring herself to mention Fellows by name and just called him Mr. Z. But I think the point is they're the kind of point of contact. So they're the visible face of the enemy. So when you're a member of the royal family and you're having sort of perhaps territorial battles with other members of the family, or you've got a different agenda, you're trying to push your agenda and they don't agree with it, and you're not necessarily dealing with actual other members of the royal family. You're not actually, back in Fergie's day, you might not have been dealing with the Queen so much, but you are dealing with the people who work for them. They become the visible face of the enemy. And they have got a long-term view. So rightly or wrongly, they believe they're working for the best benefit of the institution. And you come along as perhaps an outsider marrying into the royal family, and you've got your own ideas, and the two clash. So you don't necessarily have rows with your mother-in-law or whoever it is, or your grandmother, whoever it is. You have rows with the people who are trying to keep the show on the road. I mean, it could be that they're right and they see the long-term health of the institution as a priority, or it could be that they're stuffy and stuck in their ways, whichever way you want to see it. But that's where the clashes come.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned Harry, of course, because there's a brilliant anecdote in your book, in Courtiers, where you're on a foreign trip. I think you're on your way to Australia from Tonga. Is that right? And Harry had been advised by his courtiers that perhaps it might be a good idea to go and meet the press, because they come all this way to follow him and write about his trip. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because that's an extraordinary anecdote.
I remember that day well. We were flying back from Tonga to Sydney. It was about a 5-hour flight or something, and the press people working for Harry and Meghan said that they will come to the back of the plane and have a word with us, which is something that often happens. It's an informal moment. It's off the record. It's not for reporting, but it's a bit of human contact between the royals and the media. And we were waiting, and they didn't come back. We thought, oh my goodness, it's not going to happen. And then the plane touched down. We thought, well, okay, that's not going to happen. And then, only after the plane touched down, Harry and Meghan came to the back of the plane. And Harry said at one point, "Thanks very much for coming, even though you weren't invited." And this just went down so badly because, it was incredibly rude. And also, it was just plain wrong. Harry, I don't know if anyone told you, old boy, we actually were invited. That person standing next to you, a press person, they invited us. Anyway, afterwards, we made our feelings known to Harry's press person, saying, how rude it was. Because, a lot of people, we've been away for weeks, for about 2 weeks or so. People had left families behind. People got kids. It's quite a sort of sacrifice going on these tours. It's also great to go on these tours, but, they don't cost you nothing. So Harry was told that what he'd said had gone down really badly. And he turned to his advisor and said, "Well, you shouldn't have made me do it." Which, I mean, please, it's vintage Kevin the Teenager, isn't it? It really was this kind of pathetic thing to say. But also, it just shows that how these advisors, they are important, and sometimes the members of the royal family do what they're told.
Well, that's it. I was about to follow up on that, because that's the kind of you made me do it sort of element. And how much power do you think they have? Because obviously in that situation there was a kind of a tug going on. He didn't want to come and thank the press for coming. He didn't want them to be there at all, by the sounds of it. But he was sort of made to do it by the courtiers. So how much is it the crown, the royal family, advising the courtiers, and them facilitating what the members of the royal family want to do, and how much is it that the power lies with the courtiers and their will and what they think is right, and guiding the family.
Yeah, an awful lot lies with the courtiers because, and when I was writing my book, one of the things I was really interested in was the different techniques the courtiers use to get their way, to persuade the member of the royal family who might be reluctant to do something, that in fact it's a good idea to do it. So people told me about how you'd, rather than getting into a full-blown row, because there's no point getting into a row because you end up losing your job. But if you explain what the consequences of your actions will be, well, yes, so you could do that, but if you did that, this will happen and that will happen, and do you actually want that? And another technique, absolute classic courtier technique, is to sort of recruit allies. So, if you're dealing with Charles, say, you might go and have a word with Camilla, and sort of try and talk her.
Very wise.
Sort of kind of pincer action. And in fact, the late Queen was very open to this. If someone had an idea, they'd go and put it to her, and she'd say, yes, why don't you go and talk to Philip about it? And Philip was a very good person to talk to. He quite enjoyed the kind of thrashing out of issues. So you go and talk to Philip, and if you can convince him that something is the right thing to do, then you could convince the Queen. But, there was a classic example. People might remember the famous interview with Prince Charles, as he was, by Jonathan Dimbleby, the one in which he admitted having committed adultery. Now, this caused a huge fuss at the time, and sometime later Charles was at a dinner party. And people, his fellow guests, his friends, were saying that they thought it wasn't a terribly good idea to confess to being unfaithful to Diana. And at which point Charles pointed an angry finger at his private secretary, Richard Aylard, and said, "He made me do it." So there's a definite element. But also, some of the really big decisions, they are, in the end, taken by the members of the royal family. In the early 90s, there's a big fuss about whether the Queen would pay income tax. But and she did in 1992. She agreed to start paying income tax. But a few years earlier, one of her private secretary, an Australian called Bill Heseltine, had actually written an internal paper saying, "I think the Queen should pay income tax. I think there's a body of opinion building up in the country that this would be a good thing to do," and it was just kind of too early. And the idea got nowhere. It was kind of rebuffed. So the big decisions are taken by the Queen, and we saw that with Megxit. So perhaps we'll discuss about it further. But in the end, it was what the Queen felt that was the decisive factor.
Because that came out last week, didn't it? We had Harry's court case as he's lost his appeal to have his security reinstated. The security that provided by Scotland Yard, the police, whenever he comes to Britain, and he'd lost that bid in the court. He says he's going to appeal the decision, but in the documents, it was quite interesting to see that Simon Case, who was actually William's private secretary at the time, was the man who was largely responsible for drafting up, the various options that would then be presented to Harry, and that it was interesting to see in those legal documents, and again in your book as well, how the palace courtiers were instrumental in trying to solve that sort of Harry problem in a way that would be palatable to the senior members of the royal family. So at the time, the Queen, the Prince of Wales, as was now King Charles, and Prince William. And can you tell us a bit about that, how the courtiers were sort of instrumental in that?
So all these the key courtiers, who were Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, and Simon Case, Williams, they basically got together and tried to thrash this out. But this key paper, the one, as you wrote in your story, outlining the 5 different scenarios, was mainly written by Simon Case. And you have to ask yourself why that was. Why wasn't Edward Young, the most senior of them, why didn't he write it? or alternatively, why didn't Clive Alderton write it? Clive Alderton, who was leading, according to my sources, was very much leading these discussions. He didn't write it either. I mean, he's a cunning
He is
operator,
indeed.
Clive, and one might think cynically that he didn't write it because he wanted to keep his fingerprints off it. I don't know, but it does show they were all trying to solve this thing. And of course, it wasn't a contentious paper because it was just saying, okay, here's 5 different ways to try and address this issue of Harry and Meghan wanting a different way of working. Here are the possibilities, and this is what we have to talk about. So it wasn't taking any decisions. It was saying, this is what we have to talk about.
And who do you think? Who do you think survived? Well, obviously, I think Clive is probably one of the big survivors, isn't he, of the courtiers of royal times? Because when you talked about George V and his valued courtier, it seems that Charles really cannot do without Clive. He really does value Sir Clive as he is now. And that's an interesting relationship, isn't it? That he obviously relies on Clive a lot. We see him in the documentaries, like you say, in the background, presenting the king with that red box of daily government papers. So he's obviously someone who's now very at the heart of it, at the heart of the kind of the institution.
Yeah, I mean, Clive is a great survivor. It was interesting in previous reigns, when a new monarch has succeeded to the throne, they have tended to inherit the private secretary of their predecessor. But that clearly wasn't going to happen this time because Clive had worked for Charles for years, and there was no way that Clive was going to just take on his mother's private secretary, Edward Young, who did stay for about 6 months. So there was a transition, there was a handover, but it was always clear from before the palace announced anything the way that one was going to go. And of course, we all remember, you talk about Clive being indispensable, we all remember someone else who's indispensable, Michael
Indeed.
Fawcett. Charles couldn't live without Michael. Well, he became dispensable in the end, didn't he?
Well, yes, I suppose the heads still do roll even in the modern royal family, just in other ways, through the kind of the letter in the post, perhaps, of the the P40 or whatever it is you get when you leave your job. Angela Kelly, if we can speak about her as well, because she was a brilliant character who didn't survive through to the new reign because she was very close to the late Queen. She was a dresser, but she became invaluable in so many ways as a kind of confidant, and would seem to be always around the late Queen Elizabeth II, and very treasured, but perhaps not so well liked by the new regime. What can you tell us about Angela?
Yeah, Angela's Liverpudlian, daughter of a dockyard crane driver. She amazing character, very forceful woman. Her name Angela Kelly. Her nickname was AK-47, which tells you a little bit about her relationship with other people in the palace. But hugely different background for the Queen, but they had a real bond. There was a famous story that they were looking in the mirror together once, and Angela Kelly said, or perhaps the Queen said, I can't remember, one of them said, we could be sisters. And again, it's like the private secretary. If you spend that long with someone, you develop a bond. And Angela Kelly was able to talk to the Queen, relate to the Queen in the way that no one else was able to. It really was a sort of a very deep bond. And in a kind of rather silly but telling detail, she had the same size feet as the Queen, and she used to break in her shoes for her. So new pair of shoes for the Queen. The new shoes were always uncomfortable, and the person who wore them for a bit to break them in was Angela Kelly. I mean, it tells you a lot about their relationship.
So funny, isn't it? It's like no other job on the planet to be a courtier to a member of the royal family, surely, or maybe equivalent to being an aide to a VIP celebrity, Hollywood celebrity or something. But it's quite.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities with being an aide to a celebrity like that, but not the same kind of level of politicking, because you, as a courtier, particularly with the courtier to the monarch, you're not just dealing with the royal world, you're dealing with the political world. I mean, a very strong part of their world is say with the monarch's private secretary, is to deal with Downing Street, to deal with the Prime Minister's private secretary, to deal with the cabinet secretary. It's incredibly close, and we saw that in 2010 when the cabinet secretary Gus O'Donnell under Gordon Brown drew up this cabinet manual, part of which was to draw up a sort of system of rules or guidelines for what happened when there was a hung parliament. The aim of this was to make sure that the Queen, as she then was, didn't get involved with kind of actively choosing a prime minister. They wanted it so that the politicians, if there's a hung parliament, the politicians had to decide who was going to be recommended to be prime minister, and then you'd go to the Queen. But the Queen's private secretary, Christopher Geidt, now Lord Geidt, he was strongly involved in those negotiations, and also deeply involved with what was going on in Downing Street in the days after the election. He was constantly in touch with Gordon Brown's office, monitoring what was going on with Brown, what was going on with the negotiations with Clegg. He was absolutely in there. So a pivotal player in the kind of political scene at the time.
And there's a great deal about that in your book. There's a brilliant chapter about the golden triangle, that link between kind of government and palace life as well, and how the royal family can be deployed as diplomats on behalf of the British government, which is a fascinating read and recommend it to anybody. Well, it's lovely to chat to you, Val. I think we could probably chat for ages, couldn't we? But I will I'll say goodbye, and we certainly look forward to watching, you know, what other books you do in the future, and we'll be watching this space and hopefully come back and talk to us about it.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me, Kate.
Thanks so much, Val. Take care.